does my calendar show that worshiping and fellowshipping God's people is a priority? Let that soak in for just a second. If somebody pulled your daytimer book, or they looked at your calendar on your phone or on your computer, without any input from you, would they come to a conclusion that worshiping God and fellowshipping His people had a priority in your life? What about allowing time for personal study and prayer? Sometimes you'll hear the phrase, if I was called in front of a jury and accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict me? And certainly this is a case in point for that. If you were called in front of a jury and had to defend yourself against an accusation that you spent too much time in personal study and prayer, how would that play out? Would your use of time be enough to convince a jury of your peers that you were, in fact, dedicated to personal study and prayer? Am I using my time to serve others, and particularly God's people? And if the answers to these questions were uncomfortable, we probably have to conclude that maybe we love the world more than we should. Because if we're not allowing time in our schedule for these things, we're certainly in danger of falling into the trap about which John warned us. What about the use of our resources? Got a picture there of a pile of $100 bills. Many of us would probably look at that and think, man, if only I had that pile of those $100 bills, that would fix a lot of things going on, wouldn't it? And yet, the New Testament challenges us to properly use our resources and allow those to be a demonstration of whether we love God or love the world. Questions. Am I using my resources to help the church and others? Or am I attempting to lay up treasures on earth? Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 is a passage that many of us will be familiar with, where Jesus addresses this. And it's interesting, if you look up that verse, where I've got quoted there, lay up treasures on earth, Jesus uses two important words that he inserts ahead of that. And what does he say there? What two words does he use before he makes that statement? Do not. And yet, if we find ourselves laying up treasures on earth for that purpose, we might have to question whether we love the world more than we love God. Mark chapter 8, verses 36 through 37. I see I misspelled Mark there. Mark chapter 8, verses 36 and 37. Jesus talks there about a person that would forfeit his soul to gain the whole world. Have you ever seen anybody that did that? Have you seen anybody that sacrificed their reputation, maybe sacrificed their relationships, maybe sacrificed all kinds of things in their life to gain prestige or power or money? There are so many examples that we'd never have time to cover them all, of people that have made that exchange. They forfeited their soul and their love for God to gain earthly things. Certainly, we can tell much about our relationship with God and whether we're fulfilling the charge that John gave to us to not love the world by looking at the use of our resources. But another way that we can discern whether we love the world more than we love God is to think about those things that we leave behind. We've talked quite a bit about material possessions, and I know I told you at the beginning we weren't going to talk about those but we have to in some respect, because that's something that we have to leave out. One of the things that we learn about our material possessions is they're not eternal. Over in Luke chapter 12 and verse 20, Jesus is telling a parable about a man there that is trying to accumulate all this wealth and lay up great things for himself. And he uses a phrase there that we don't typically use, but I'll use it because it's appropriate to the context here. He calls this man a fool because he's so wrapped up in pursuit of these things and completely fails to realize that one day all of his stuff will belong to somebody else. And we know that to be true. All the things that we might accumulate in life are someday going to belong to somebody else. How many of you have seen families that are torn apart after the death of a loved one fighting over money and stuff? I see so many heads shaking here in the auditorium because we've all seen it. We've seen people that love the world so much that they would destroy their family, they would destroy their relationship, arguing over things that someone else left behind. And make no mistake, we're going to leave a lot behind in this world. Some of those will be possessions, but those don't matter. What does is the seed of faith in Christ that we have planted in the lives of others, or maybe we haven't. Turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. The Apostle Paul here is talking to his young protege, Timothy. And we see, particularly here in the book of 2 Timothy, having to encourage him in difficult times. And he begins this second letter to Timothy talking about heritage. And in verse 5 of chapter 1, he references a couple of very important people in the life of Timothy. Who's that? Who does he reference there? His mother and his grandmother. And he reminds Timothy, and I'll characterize it in this way. He reminds him about that seed of faith that was faithfully planted in his life by his mother and his grandmother, and how that left a heritage for him. And when we're more focused on the physical things that we leave behind to our children or others than we are to the spiritual things that we leave behind, we certainly are in danger of loving the world more than we love God. See, all of these things are important for us to think about and consider as we go through and try to determine, am I falling prey to this warning that John extended here in 1 John chapter 2? So as we're reminded about John's charge to us to not love the world or the things that are in the world, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Do you want to be there? Do you want to not have the love of the Father in your life? That's really the end result of John's warning here. If we love the world, we're not going to be able to maintain the love of the Father in our life. And it's important that we be aware of that threat and that challenge in our everyday activities and in our relationships. John warns us about this because it's important to us, and not only can it jeopardize our soul, it can also jeopardize the soul of others. Yes, sir? Absolutely. And his comment there, if you couldn't hear that, was about a man named Demas in the New Testament that is described later as loving this present world and having abandoned Paul and his work because he loved the world more than he loved God. And certainly there are other examples that we could talk about in the New Testament, but this is real. It's very, very real. The world is subtle and the world is deceptive, and it can steal God's love from our heart if we allow it. And the way that we allow it is by loving the world and the things that are in the world. While we're commanded to love, that love is to be directed towards God, towards His people, and those that are needing Christ. Our love for the creation, our physical lives, or even our relationships must never displace our duty to love as God has commanded. Yes, sir? Yeah. It is. And it's a difficult situation. And there are many things in our life today and certainly in our political environment that are very charged and pointed and seem difficult. And they certainly seem to us to be headed in the wrong direction. And I would just remind all of us that if you go back and you look at the book of Romans, for instance, and you understand what the first century Christians experienced in their lives from a political and a social standpoint, they were thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. They were crucified. They were burned as torches to light pathways. There are all kinds of horrible things that occurred. And certainly one thing that we can learn about our world is it is a place of sin and evil. And that's why John has called us to not love the world, but instead to love God and to love others as God has charged them. Thank you for your time and participation this morning. Hey, Mark. Yeah, I keep forgetting to take it back there and plug it in, but if you're going to need it, I was going to leave it up here. But if not, okay, yeah. Okay, all right, that works.